Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the State of Education in America, presented to you by One Room Education. My name's Katie, and I'll be your guide as we discuss the topic of today's conversation, which is going to be a brief history of the education system in America. Today I'll be covering a wide range of topics, including the evolution of the education system here in America between the late colonial period and the modern day. I'll be discussing who had access to that education system and why, and I'll also be discussing the roles of men and women, and finally we'll be discussing the active role of the students in their own education and how the expectations of those students has evolved over time. I hope that this sounds interesting to you. If it does, come on in, have a seat, and let's have a chat about the brief history of education in America. All right, let's get right into it. So we're going to be discussing the education system in the late colonial period first. And the main thing to remember about this is that it wasn't really something that you would call a system, at least in the majority of the colonies, because in the New England colonies, yes, they had much more structured education system. But whenever you're getting into the middle and lower colonies, the southern colonies, it becomes the education system becomes much more spread out. It is primarily home based. And in all 13 colonies, the idea that you would go to school, get your degree, and then go to work for someone else wasn't really something that you did. So, again, in the northern colonies, yes, like New England, Boston, New York, places like that, sure. But in the rest of the colonies, unless you came from a family of pretty good means and they could afford to get you a private tutor, once you were done learning how to read the Bible, you were going to go and you were going to learn a trade from the tradesmen themselves. So if you wanted to be a farmer like your family, then you would just go straight into that. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you would have to find a blacksmith and go apprentice with them. If you wanted to be a carpenter, you would be a carpenter's apprentice. The apprenticeship program, the apprenticeship idea was something that was viewed as the main form of education for people that weren't in the, let's call it the intellectual class of the American colonies. So, at this time in our nation's history, women and slaves weren't really able to attend any form of formal education. Slaves, absolutely, there was no education for them whatsoever unless their masters allowed them to be educated, which there were some that would do that. But for the absolute majority, that just did not happen. That most of the education was reserved for the men. However, after the Revolutionary War ended and the new government was being finalized, the founding fathers expanded the idea of what education was and who should have access to it. So the founding fathers knew that, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged, unquote. This means that the new Republican government that was set up for the United States, for this new Republican government in the United States to work, it must be led by a moral and educated people. In this time period, religion, Christianity specifically, was how everyone learned about moral behavior and what their roles were expected to be in society. The founding fathers advocated for everyone from the lowly farmer to the most wealthy among us to become educated in the ways of economics, literacy, and governance, since they would have to understand all of these aspects to be able to participate in their new government responsibly. You see, the founding fathers were an eclectic bunch of people made up of lawyers and farmers and merchants and businessmen, writers, and even physicians. This meant that they understood the importance of education. But even more important than formal education to the founding fathers was that they understood the importance of being able to learn new skills and ideas yourself through reading and practice. One of the things that the founding fathers also understood was that reading wasn't taught outside of the Bible. So, if the job that your family was involved in and that you were expected to go into did not involve a large amount or any reading for that matter, then you weren't taught how to read or where to find information like we are in today's education system. So, this idea that everyone should have access to education was actually pretty new and fundamentally changed the world over time. Thanks to the idea of the farmer scholar, the literacy rate in early America, something that's kind of hard to follow because the ability to read was directly related to where you lived in America. Remember, I talked about like the educated north and then the middle colonies and the southern colonies, and the way that you were educated differed depending on where you were. So it makes it really hard to calculate a literacy rate overall for the American colonies. However, there is a very interesting article that I found on Freakonomics, of all places, on the book Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and how they have been able to use the sales and comprehension of the material within that book to calculate literacy rates, like relative literacy rates over time. It's really very interesting, and I highly suggest just a quick skim of it, if nothing else. I'll leave the link to the article in the description of this podcast. According to this method of measurement, the literacy rate of Americans has declined over time, believe it or not, from roughly 20% in 1776 when Common Sense was published to around 13% when the article was published in 2011, which is just kind of mind blowing whenever you think about it. That rural farmers and people that were still doing bleeding as a legitimate form of medical care were able to read better than we are today with all of our modern technology. Let that one sink in for a little bit. So, in addition to the idea that everyone, meaning all free people at this time, should be able to read, the founding fathers helped champion the idea of Republican motherhood. Now, quick note on Republican motherhood, they don't mean the Republican Party. Republican meant the Republic of the United States of America. The United States of America is not a democracy. I'm sorry to inform all of you. The United States of America is a Republican system with democratic elections. We'll get into that in another episode, but that's just, I needed to get that out. So, the idea of Republican motherhood was that women, mothers specifically, but any woman that was involved in general child rearing should be educated in the ways of academics and virtue, since they were the primary teachers and educators of the children. And it was going to be their job to lead the way for and teach the future generations of male voters in America. So, if these women that were the stay at home mothers, and that's just kind of what they did, and they didn't really have any other choices within the colonial and early American economic systems. So, the founding fathers said, you know what, you guys are the Republican mothers. You are the mothers of this republic that we have created for our children. So, you, as the women, as the mothers, as the caregivers, and and the caretakers of this future of our republic, we need to make sure that you are educated in the ways of the virtues that we would like our children to have and carry on in order to maintain this form of government. And we also want to make sure that they're able to continue that education throughout their history. So these women need to be literate and they need to be able to do basic math and stuff like that so that they can teach our sons, right? Because remember, at this time period, women still couldn't vote and they didn't really have a role outside of the household in most of the American colonies and the early American states. So, with the idea of Republican motherhood at the forefront of their minds, the founding fathers established the first female academies. Get this, in 1790. I don't know about you, but I know pretty much all of my students that I work with through my private tutoring business. Almost none of them know that there were schools for women before like 1900. Almost every single one of my students that I work with, and I work with middle and high schoolers primarily, but I also work with college students, and my college students are included in this. Almost every single one of them thinks that female education specifically started in the 1900s, like outside of finishing school. So I think that that's an interesting note to make about the misconceptions of the education system in early America. So I wanted to make sure to go ahead and include the idea of Republican motherhood and why it's just so immensely important. Now, if you want to learn more about any of the topics that I talk about today in this podcast, I'm going to be linking my sources that I used for this outside of my own general knowledge of the subject for this episode in the description below, and you can always head over to one-roomeducation.com for a full list of all of the podcast episodes as well as all of the citations for all of the episodes. So now we're going to move on into the early industrial period in America. So after the Revolutionary War, we have women being educated, we have kids being educated, we have farmers, we have every single person in the United States, every single free person in the United States, being educated in some way, right? We're not going to talk about the specifics of any of that in today's podcast. I will be having specific lessons on these topics coming up in the future, but I'm not going to get into them today because I'm trying to keep it brief, but you'll find out that's very hard for me. So let's go ahead and talk about why the industrial system of economics goes hand in hand with the establishment of what we consider the modern education system. So if you look at the history of education that we've discussed thus far, it is all about the family business, right? It's about the family business. It's about the future of the country. So with the idea of the future of the country, we're going to kind of follow that line of thought from here on out with the education system as a nation. And we're going to move a little bit away from the regional education systems that we had in the late colonial period and early American period. And we're going to move more into a structured system. So what am I talking about whenever I talk about the regional system versus the universal structured systems? So the regional systems, as I discussed earlier, are the more formal education systems of New England. The mixed sort of system in the middle colonies in Pennsylvania and Virginia, where you're talking more homeschool type of variety of schooling. You also had the structured education in the urban centers like Philadelphia, but for the most part, it was individuals educating their own children. And then in the South, you had the communal schools where you would have a bunch of farmers get together and they would hire a teacher to come in and teach their kids as sort of like a teaching co-op thing. After the Industrial Revolution, people migrated from those rural settings in the middle and southern colonies to create the urban centers around the manufacturing centers, right? Because you have to live where you work. That's people migrate around the US all the time still today for work. That's like a thing. So We see that happening during the Industrial Revolution. So as you move to a more urban setting, you have less support structure that has been established of your family and friends, and you're moving somewhere that you don't really have that. And then on top of that, a lot of times the father would get a job in the factories, and then the mothers would get some sort of, like, we would call it a side hustle today, right? So while the father and sometimes the mothers as well are working in this factory, what do we do with all of these kids? That was a problem that they were having in the urban centers, because they were having all of these kids essentially being feral children running around trying to not educate themselves, but just running around doing like hoodlums and just being delinquents essentially, because they didn't have anybody to teach them their educational foundations or their virtues, right? Because if the Republican motherhood that was established by the founding fathers, remember they were there to educate the future of America, if those Republican mothers aren't there for the foundation of the education anymore, then who's going to fill that role? Because that's still something that needs to be done. So in the urban centers, they came up with this idea of the school day. So the public school system in America was essentially established as a form of daycare to help parents be able to work longer hours. And yes, that's honestly what it is. And if you look at the modern education system, that's still what it is. And as you get farther and farther away from the idea of Republican motherhood and farther away from the home education or localized, like hyper localized system of education, the less the children or students, depending on the age group, if you're talking about higher education, the less they're taught how to think and how to learn. And they're taught what to think and what to learn. That transition during the Industrial Revolution that happened in education, where we went from teaching kids, here's how to read, here's how to write, here's how to do math. Take these skills and go apply them to what you want to do in life. We went from that to sit in a classroom for 6 to 8 hours a day, sit still, don't move. I know you're 6 years old, but no, you can't run around. No, you can't play in the dirt. No, you can't do any of that stuff. You have to sit here with 19 to 30 other kids that also have to sit here, because that's a lot of people for one person to look after. And you have to, quote unquote, learn these essentials, quote unquote, essentials to modern life, right? So how did they establish what would be taught in the modernized education system that they were going to then sell to the parents? So what they did was they went around to the economic leaders, so the owners of the manufacturing facilities, and they said, what skills do you need people to know to be able to work in your factories? And they said, well, we need them to know how to listen, we need them to know how to follow orders, and we need them to know how to show up on time, essentially, right? So what got taught in school? You got taught to sit there, listen, follow instructions. You got taught to know timing between lessons. You got taught to know how to move around a facility as opposed to a home. So this stuff gets set up during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America, and it carries through today. If you look at the bills that are being presented in Congress today, that have to do with education, they always say, well, we talked to the leaders in industry, and they say that this is what they're looking for, so that's what our kids have to be learning. Well, I hate to share this with you. I mean, it might be a newsflash to you. It's not to me, but it might be to you. I don't really care what the leaders of industry are looking for in somebody, Because if you look at the true leaders of industry, if you look at the Mark Zuckerbergs, if you look at the Elon Musks, if you look at whoever's in charge of Google right now, please don't ask me to say his name because I'm not going to get it right. And, if you look at the true leaders of industry, the number one thing that they say is that they don't care what education level somebody has. If you bring them somebody that has the skills to learn, they have learned the knowledge themselves and are able to apply it, that those people are far more driven, have far more worth within the workplace than the people that they have hired previously with master's or doctoral degrees in these subjects. Why is that? Because if you have somebody that goes to school for something, right? I went to school for education. Why did I go to school for education? Because I am passionate about sharing information with people. I am passionate about seeing people understand concepts and then being able to apply them through a wide variety of aspects of their life over their lifetime. That's my passion. And I said, okay, how do I do that? Okay, I'll go into education. So I went to school for something that I was passionate about. What's the criteria that most people use when they're looking at a higher education degree? They're looking at, where can I make the most money? Which careers have the most money available? So right now in 2022, that is the tech industry, right? Because it's booming. And of course, I'm talking to you on a podcast. So everybody's using it, right? Everybody's using tech in some way or another. So of course there's a boom in that. So people are going to school for that, but they're not passionate about it. And when you go to a post-secondary institution for stuff like coding, for stuff like, I don't even know what you go into, like web design and stuff. I don't even know what kind of degree you get to work in the tech industry, to be totally honest. It's just not my realm. But when you go to school for those things, you're taught what to do and how to do it. You're not taught the theories behind it. You're not taught the structure behind it. You're not taught how to do basic problem solving outside of this box that you've put yourself in inadvertently, right? So that's why if you're looking at the leaders of tech like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else really, they want people that graduated high school or got their GED and then taught themselves the skills that they would need to go into that career. Because what does that do? You struggle for it, you strive, you learn, you fail, you learn, you succeed. There's that cycle, right? Of learning, trying, failing, learning some more, trying again, and then you succeed. If you aren't taught that full cycle and you're just taught learn, try, that's it. You learn, you try, you do. Because that's how it's set up in college. You learn, you try, you do. You learn, you try, you do. There is no fail, right? Obviously you can fail a class, but so far as everything is set up for you, everything is laid out for you, and it's a relatively easy path. Not saying that every class is easy or everybody's life is easy. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's structured for you not to have to struggle as much, right? The more people they can get through the for-profit educational institutions, the more money they will make. So that's just how they have it structured. And when you're learning something like, I'm still extremely passionate about sharing my knowledge with the world. So how am I doing that? I've had a couple blogs, I've had a couple social media accounts, this is my first podcast, but I'm very much enjoying it. And what I had to do to be able to share my stories and share my education and share my knowledge with people has been, I've had to learn how to do this whole like online marketing tech thing and learn how to market myself online and not just in person, and learn how to do web development and website maintenance and all of this stuff. Like I've had to teach myself all of these aspects. I could have gone out and paid somebody, but I don't have that kind of money. I don't know who does, but whatever. And so I taught myself. I struggled, I failed, I learned some more. I went back to the drawing board, and I have become rather proficient at almost everything that I do online now. And that's because I've struggled and I've failed and I've learned from those failures and those struggles. And that concept of failure and struggle has been completely taken out of the modern education system. And I think it's been to our detriment. Now, I'm sure that you thought that I was going to be talking about women's rights and civil rights and all of that stuff and equal access to education and all of that stuff. Don't worry, I'll get to it. But I wanted to make sure to give you an introduction, not only to the history of education in America, that it's sort of a lost history of education in America, because unless you're in an AP class or an honors class in high school, you're not learning this. You're not learning that women had access to education in early America. Learning that the role of women was extremely important in education in America. And you're not learning about the decline of literacy and the decline of the expectation of the students over time. Because why would this education system that has done these things want you to know about them? I'm going to go ahead and end it there today. I just wanted to give you a general background of the history of education in America from my perspective and let you know where I'm coming from in the rest of this podcast, what my general view of education is. So I hope that this was informative for you, and I hope that you'll join me on this journey as we discuss the state of education in America from a variety of aspects. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to go ahead and follow it and make sure that you don't miss any episodes on whichever platform you're listening to this on. And if you'd like to see some behind the scenes content or see when I'm looking for interviewers, please go ahead and head over to my social medias. On Facebook, we are at One Room Education, and on Instagram, I have oneroom_education. And if you would like to go ahead and have access to articles and resources provided to you by educators, not only professional educators, but also homeschooling parents and teachers that work at trade schools and apprenticeship, please go ahead and head over to one-roomeducation.com. That's one-roomeducation.com for all of your educational resources. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I look forward to seeing you next time as we discuss the state of education in America.